Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Kate Kuzminski, the Senior Fellow and Program Director of the Military Veterans and Society Program here at the Center for New American Security. CNAS is committed to bold, innovative, bipartisan research that drives national security policy forward. The Military Veterans and Society Program focuses our research on military personnel, veterans, and the civil-military divide. Our program explores how the military services can access, recruit, and retain the talent necessary to fight and win the nation's future wars. As part of our research, we examine the effect of policies, practices, and elements of service culture that enable or constrain the service's access to talent. We further explore how the services and DoD may draw from a talent pool that reflects the society from which it is drawn, particularly as there is a limited pool of qualified candidates for military service. Lastly, we focus on organizational change management in DoD, particularly with respect to personnel policy. Today, we are pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel of experts with a vast amount of experience on these important topics through their individual roles in the implementation of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Repeal. Don't Ask, Don't Tell served as the official federal policy banning openly gay service members who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, implemented in 1994. The 17-year policy was repealed in December 2010, with the full implementation by DoD and the services 10 years ago today on September 20th, 2011. Leading today's panel is Doug Wilson, who served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs in 2011 and the first openly gay Senate-confirmed appointee in the Department of Defense. We are also joined by both the DoD General Counsel from 2011, Jeh Johnson, and the Department of the Air Force General Counsel from 2011, Gordon Tanner, who are responsible for thinking through the legal considerations surrounding the repeal's implementation. We are further joined by Virginia Penrod, who served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Military Personnel Policy in 2011, who was responsible for thinking through the implementation plan and its impact on personnel management throughout the department. Former Representative Patrick Murphy also joins us today, speaking about the congressional role in the repeal's implementation, and will further be joined by video by Senator Susan Collins, who also played a significant role. Lastly, the implementation of the repeal involved key voices from the advocacy community. We are pleased to be joined by Aubrey Sarvis, who served as the Executive Director of the Service Members Legal Defense Network, who played a crucial role in the repeal. We'll be taking audience questions through the CNAS platform throughout today's discussion, so please submit those questions as we proceed. Now I'd like to turn it over to Doug Wilson, who will lead today's event.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thanks to you and the entire CNAS team for being willing to organize this discussion featuring some of my closest friends and colleagues who were on the front lines of both the repeal and the implementation of the repeal in 2010 and 2011. I have right here a little pocket calendar back in 2011 when we didn't rely 100% on our cell phones for everything, including scheduling. At the Pentagon, we used to carry these little pocket calendars, and mine for 10 years ago today notes that at 2 o'clock there would be a Secretary of Defense and Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff presser. What that meant was that at 2 o'clock on that cloudy Tuesday, I had the honor of being able to go to the podium at the Pentagon and introduce then Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta and then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, to declare the formal end of the law known as Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and that all had been set for the full implementation of the repeal, and that good order and discipline was not going to be affected. And to many of us, proof that the final ability for men and women who had been hidden for so long in doing their duty and serving their country could now serve as whole human beings. There are many people who were path trailblazers along the way. We have 6 of them on the panel today. I want to, before we start, also acknowledge and thank people like Dixon Osborne and Michelle Beneke, who were co-founders of the Service Members Legal Defense Fund, people who were on the front lines during the repeal, people like Winnie Stackelberg at the Center for American Progress, Fred Sains at the Human Rights Campaign, Matt Bennett and his team at Third Way, Aaron Belkin at the Palm Center, the folks at RAND who did so much to provide data and support for the comprehensive report, those at OutServe, the many men and women in uniform at LGBT who remained in hiding but still had tremendous input on the report. At the White House, of course, Valerie Jarrett and Brian Bond and Jim Messina. And I want to give a special shout out to the person at the White House who I think was an unsung hero of the repeal, Dennis Mcdonough, who is now the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, and how lucky we are to have such an empathetic individual heading Veterans Affairs. And of course, at the Pentagon, Admiral Mike Mullen, who basically said at the very beginning of the repeal process, I support this because we cannot ask our men and women in uniform to live a lie. And people in my office like Cynthia Smith, Eileen Linez, and Carl Vogue, who helped on the communications all the way along. But I want to start by calling on my dear friend Aubrey Sarvis, who headed the Service Members Legal Defense Fund at the time. And Aubrey, I have to tell you that when I first went to the Pentagon, you were kind enough to invite me to come to your offices. And around a table were 20 men and women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, all admirals, generals, senior officers, all LGBT, all of whom had to lead double lives throughout their entire careers. And I will never forget meeting a personal hero of mine, Margaret Greta Kammermeyer, and remember seeing the amazing television program documenting her life. And it was at that point that I had to tell those around the table, had the honor of telling those around the table, that in their honor, I would be doing everything possible to make sure that their successors would not have to go through what they went through in their military service. So Aubrey, I'm going to start with you and ask if you could just speak for 2 or 3 minutes and give us a sense of the history and perspective of both current and those serving in the military at the time on the repeal.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you very much. And as you point out, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell was an extraordinary effort by a remarkable team, of several of whom you just named, and many of whom are no doubt with us today. I won't go back to the history of the gay ban. I think everyone on here knows about that. I will only say that the gay ban went back to the First Continental Army. And yes, General Washington's Army drummed out the first service member for being gay. And that practice, that tradition, that custom continued largely through regulations. And it did so until 10 years ago. There was a change in 1993 when President Clinton tried to issue an executive order to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or to allow gays and lesbians to serve openly, I should say. There was a big backfire, not just from the Pentagon, but from Democrats as well as Republicans on Capitol Hill. And so the new president quickly retreated. And what we got was Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And as you, Doug, and Admiral Mullen pointed out in his testimony, that was a big lie, and it was doomed to fail. But that lie continued. So for 8 years, we had the Clinton Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And then another 8 years, we had the Bush Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And then with the election of Barack Obama, we had the first realistic opportunity to repeal that law. And so with a Democratic president, a Democratic House and Senate, we were ready to tackle that opportunity. Now at SLDN, for several years, we have been providing legal services to gay and lesbian service members who were caught up in the crossfire of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. We had also been drafting legislation to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And in fact, when the new president came in, we had over 140 House co-sponsors for repeal. And the Speaker Pelosi at that time, urged us to come up with 200 so that she would have the confidence to bring this bill not only out of committee, but to the floor for implementation. At SLDN, we were very anxious for you, Doug, and for Jay and all the others on the White House team to move in a timely fashion on repeal. It was my view that the new president, like most new presidents, would only have 2 years to achieve most of his legislative agenda. And we wanted repeal to be in his agenda. Excuse me. And so there was some initial tension and friction about the timeline, but quickly, I think everyone came together. Our goal at SLDN was to find the votes, and that was true of all the other organizations who were looking for repeal. I think we all knew that to be successful, the president and his team would have to bring the Pentagon along. This time, we did not want a repeat of the Clinton blowup, as it were. So the question became, what will Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen do when they are called to the Hill to testify? And several of the folks on the call today knew that they would largely have to make that happen. Now, I think they got some help along the way on the Hill. The bill that we originally drafted was modified considerably. And one of the major changes was language requiring the certification that you referred to, Doug. And that certification would be that the force was ready to make this change. And the certification would have to come from the Secretary and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I came to call it the veto effect, the Pentagon veto. While the Secretary and the Pentagon was largely supportive of the legislative process moving, it was only with the legislation amended with new language that in effect gave the final word to whether there would be repeal or not to the Pentagon. Without that certification, and I know Jeh Johnson delivered it to the White House, without that certification, there would have been no repeal.
Well, let me ask you here, Aubrey, because I certainly remember being on the phone with you in my office and you being on the floor of the Senate with Winnie Stockelberg and others, when for the second time, the repeal failed. And then we saw Susan Collins and Joe Lieberman and Harry Reid talking on the floor, and we knew that it was not dead. And we knew that it was going to be brought up again. And I will never forget in December being on the phone with you and that shout of joy that came from my office and floor of the Senate, and I know from places all over the country, that the repeal had taken effect. But let me just ask you what your view is, speaking for those service members who still had to go through 6 months of certification, plus with the cherry on top of the sundae provided by then Senator Robert Byrd, another 60 days, what their views were after that December victory. Was it fatigue? Was it resentment? Was it understanding?
I would say the word I would use was relief that the Congress had acted. But for service members, anxiety. There was still a lot of anxiety and uncertainty. And I think a recognition that we were not there all the way. And frankly, no one wanted to be the last service member discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So folks were hopeful, but they were still being cautious, very cautious. Because keep in mind, Jeh Johnson and General Ham had led this study, had engaged the force for several months on the question of should gay and lesbians be allowed to serve openly, and how would that sit with the force? Obviously, that was a very successful study and engagement by Jeh and the general. But that backdrop, there was still a lot of anxiety. So service members were still very anxious. And keep in mind, they had been at this a long time, serving in silence, serving in secrecy.
Well, there were others who were concerned as well for different reasons. Pat Murphy, when I first met Pat Murphy, he was a hero of mine before I was able to shake his hand. The courage that he showed on the battlefield was matched by the courage that he showed on the floor of the House of Representatives for so long. As the straight member of the armed services now in Congress, who was carrying the legislation for so long on the floor of the House. We're delighted to have him here today. He ended up as Undersecretary and then Acting Secretary of the Army. He's just a wonderful human being. And I want to ask you, Pat, if you would talk just a little bit about what it was like to be the one carrying that legislation for so long.
Thanks, Doug. It's great to be with you. Great to follow Aubrey Sarvis. You're both, you two, Jeh Johnson, so many others in this call are my personal role models and heroes. So it's great to be with you. I did feel somewhat of a responsibility. If you don't know, I was the only Iraq War veteran in Congress. So I was America's first Iraq War veteran, and I kind of felt a responsibility to be the voice of that 9/11 generation. I saw firsthand as an Army captain, whether I was a professor teaching constitutional law at West Point when 9/11 happened, or on my 2 combat deployments, when I saw over 13,000 of my brothers and sisters get thrown out after 9/11, when we needed folks to serve our country during a time of war, get thrown out because of who they loved. So when I had an incredible opportunity to represent the Pennsylvania 1st District in suburban Philadelphia, I jumped at the chance as a member of the Armed Services Committee and working hand in glove with Arbery, his team at SLDN, people like Emily Sussman, Dave McKeon, Trevor Thomas, so many others. And then, with Pentagon administration leaders, like you mentioned, Dennis Mcdonough, and just so many. So it wasn't easy. There were folks in the House and the Senate that were fighting against it. I do think, to me, and you have to know your audience. As a member of Congress, of course, I would talk about why it was wrong, how we kicked out over 13,000 troops after 9/11, but also how we kicked out over 114,000 troops because of who they loved since World War II. And I know, as was mentioned, this goes back to General Washington's Army, but those veterans are still alive today, and there's more work to be done. But the message, honestly, was having full faith and confidence in those men and women that wear the cloth of our country, but take that oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies and foreign domestic, and that we take that preamble of the Constitution says, in order to form a more perfect union, that our military has been ahead of social change in America, that we desegregated our military under President Truman when half the country was still segregated during the middle of the Korean War. And now that this was our chance to do right by our brothers and sisters in the LGBTQ community. So, I would go with my moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans, those who had concerns about some political ramifications, because there was religious leaders that were fighting like heck to make sure that this repeal didn't happen. And I would talk about, hey, fiscally, this cost the American taxpayer $1.2 billion since it's been implemented, and how wrong it was. But also, why, the generation of Americans that we're bringing to our military and the Army, as my perspective as a former combat veteran, professor at West Point, then Armed Services Committee, I said, listen, we bring in over 120,000 young Americans every year into our military, and they don't care about who you love. They don't care about how you identify daycare, whether or not you can do your job. So our troops, especially when in combat situations, can come home safe to see their families again. So,
Well,
I would just say,
let me just ask you this question, because while we were so grateful for you and the others in Congress who were so supportive, there were members, and certainly on the Armed Services Committee, who were pretty much the opposite. And I do remember members of the Armed Services Committee saying things about how terrible this repeal would be that will stay with me for a long time. I want to ask, though, as Aubrey mentioned, as part of the repeal, there was going to be this 6-month certification period. And then to get late Senator Byrd's vote, there was going to be an extra 60 days, which I always called the just to make sure it's not going to offend anybody period. Speaking as a former member of Congress, what were the views of your colleagues about this extra period, the 6 months and then the 60 days? How did Congress see that?
Well, some members of confidence that it was still going to get done, more the progressive side, and then for those who were just trying to put another layer of some wanted years and years to study it, and frankly, we had 4-star generals that would testify in front of our committee, in Congress, and say they were against the repeal of this hotel, and that was their professional opinion. When my colleagues would then say, "Oh, well, this person just testified," and I would say, "Hey, listen, when I would teach cadets at West Point, I would say the great thing about America is that we have separation of powers. We have 3 branches of government. It's like rocks, paper, scissors. We don't take orders from the executive branch, ladies and gentlemen. We have to do what's right for the American taxpayers. We have to do what's right for our constituents. We have to do what's right for the military, and to have the best military, and that it reflects America and the greatness of our country." So it was tough, as you know, in the House. I had the votes in our personnel subcommittee in the HASC. We had some leaders in the HASC that were against the repeal, so we just had to take it to the floor. And I worked hand in glove with Speaker Pelosi and Senator Hillier and so many others to do that, to bring it right to the floor. And we had the votes to get it passed. But there wasn't a day that didn't go by that I wasn't texting with Aubrey Sarvis or Emily Sussman and saying, "All right, we got 2 more, we're doing this, we're doing that," and working it. And also coordinating with, great Americans and talking to great Americans like Jeh Johnson and Messina and Dennis and Shelley Stillman, who was the White House at the time. Those are the folks that were doing battle every single day to make this happen. And it was not easy. And there was a lot of folks that were vehemently against it. And I think many of I've had death threats against my life during that time, against my young children. But to me, change is hard. If it was easy, everybody would do it. But this was our one chance when we knew we had a commander-in-chief of Barack Obama that would fight for it, as well as the vice president, Joe Biden, and would sign it if we got it to the finish line. And we did that. And I'm just so incredibly grateful for the great Americans on this call.
Well, you did. And I personally remember on that December day when repeal, for the 3rd time, was up for a vote as a standalone, and how many surprises there were. And maybe for me, the greatest surprise was the vote of Richard Burr, the Republican from North Carolina, who voted and basically said, based on his own personal knowledge of people in uniform, that this was time. And I think when he voted and when he spoke, he was really reflecting a change in the culture in the country. I think that the military reflects the culture that it represents. It has on so many historic periods, and I think it did at this time as well. I do remember during the Clinton administration when I had dinner with then very hidden members of the military, about 20 of them. And one of the colonels said he really hoped Don't Ask, Don't Tell would someday be repealed, but not until he retired. They were very afraid that they would lose their retirement. They were just afraid of what the reaction would be. Then, of course, came programs like Will and Grace, which I think had a profound effect on the culture and helped to set the stage. And I know that when I went to the Pentagon, and I'd been told that by the Obama administration that this was going to be the time that they were going to go for the repeal. I ended up meeting a guy named Jeh Johnson. Now, the country now knows Jeh Johnson as the former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security and one of the most articulate leaders in the Democratic Party. He is called to comment on so many things. He is one of the most respected observers of the American scene now. But at the time, he was a respected general counsel. And he was asked to head something that was called the Comprehensive Report, which Secretary Gates had asked be the vehicle by which we would determine whether or not there would be good order and discipline or have any negative effect on the troops. And his partner in crime on this was the then commander of AFRICOM, General Carter Ham. Jay, as a my friend, it is an absolute pleasure to have you here. And while you could spend and we could spend an entire discussion on the comprehensive report, I wonder if you could give our listeners just a sense here for a few minutes of what it was intended to do, what the goals were, and how it was implemented.
Sure thing, Doug. Good afternoon to you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see some of my old friends here like Aubrey and Patrick Murphy. Let me begin with this. First of all, today is an anniversary because of the repeal of the law. It's also my wife's birthday. She does not want me to forget that. This was an issue that, frankly, I was not looking for. But it tapped me on the shoulder. I was general counsel of the Department of Defense for 4 years, 2009, 2012, served with Doug in the E-ring of the Pentagon. And let me begin with this. The law, don't ask, don't tell, was actually, the phrase is a misnomer. It's a huge misnomer. Don't ask, don't tell was the policy before the law was enacted in 1993. The law actually said something very different. The law said that upon a finding of homosexuality, the member shall be separated. And a finding could include a finding of homosexual conduct, but it could also include a statement that the person is gay, which was the most controversial aspect of this. And as everyone knows, you could be outed by a third person, even if you're serving honorably and quietly without doing anything. And so it was a bad law. It was simply, even from the strictly legal point of view, it was a bad law. Barack Obama had pledged to work with the military to repeal this law. And in January 2010, the president put it in his State of the Union address that he was going to work with the Congress and military leadership to repeal the law. And that's actually what happened in 2010. To do that, Secretary Gates believed very strongly that we needed a working group or a commission to study the issue. Now, those of us who are Washington cynics know that very often a commission or a working group is used to sort of punt or delay a controversial issue. But in this case, Secretary Gates believed very strongly that this was an issue that was so controversial and it was so difficult, so emotional. And 10 years later, it's hard for us to remember how difficult this issue was 11 years ago, but it was, that he thought the military community needed to be consulted on this so that they would feel as if they were heard. And he was prepared to accept the results of this working group, whatever it may be. He volunteered me to be the co-chair of this working group. And Mike Mullen, the chairman, volunteered General Carter Ham to be the other co-chair. We led a group of about 60 people. We engaged in probably the largest, most comprehensive study of any personnel issue in the history of the Department of Defense. And we were told to assess whether don't ask, don't tell the law could be repealed by the Congress consistent with unit cohesion, that all important phrase, unit cohesion and military readiness. We took 10 months to do that. We interviewed thousands and thousands of service members. We conducted a survey of 400,000 service members. And basically we concluded, yes, with proper training and implementation, it could be repealed, consistent with unit cohesion and military readiness. Early on in the study, Carter and I recognized that much of the opposition to Don't Ask, Don't Tell was based on a stereotype of what it would like if gay service members were allowed to be open. That word open somehow conjured up a stereotype. And Carter and I both realized, listening to this, that the opposition was really based on a perception of what would happen, a perception. And I know General Ham, who was career Army, started as an Army private in 1973, was very moved by some of the anonymous confidential statements we received from gay service members who simply said, I just want to live my life in the military like everybody else and not have to lie about who I am, and repeal would take a knife out of my back. That was a quote. And that deeply influenced both of us. Then the survey results came in August of 2010, 8 months into the study. And the survey results were frankly a bit of a surprise. Basically what it came down to was 70% of the military really didn't care about this law anymore and were prepared to see it repealed. And the study was issued in late November 2010. We testified before Congress. There were members of Congress like Susan Collins, like Jim Webb, who had an open mind, who were very interested in what we had to say. And then the House and Senate voted to repeal several weeks later. And of course, the actual repeal, the implementation of it occurred 9 months after that. Looking back on it, implementation of this went much smoother than even we predicted at the time in the report, frankly, because I believe now that it was really an idea whose time had come.
Well, Jay, can I ask you a question here, based on your experience? And in doing so, I want to commend you, for how you conducted this enormous project. I mean, in political polling, most of the time a political poll consists of a pool of 300 or 400 people. So a pool of 400,000 people was quite something. And I remember traveling with you to Fort Hood as you conducted the interviews and the session in the auditorium with people who didn't want to be there. And I remember going out to see the tank. And you and I and Jonathan Lee went out to see the tank, and the general had the tank crew demonstrate how close a quarters that tank cabin was, making clear that if we repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, gay troops were going to be in close quarters with straight troops. And then he lined up his team of 5 young men in front of the tank. And he said, do you have any questions of these young men? And I said, I do. If you remember this. And I said, how long have you all been part of this tank crew together? And they said 3 or 4 years. And I said, well, if Don't Ask, Don't Tell is repealed, and one of you turned to the other 4 and said, I'm gay, what would be your reaction? And the first young man said, well, my brother's gay, so it wouldn't bother me. And the second one said, well, my cousin's gay, it wouldn't bother me either. And the third one said, I had a lot of gay friends in high school, it wouldn't bother me. The fourth one was the same. And the final one said, sir, if this tank is on fire, I don't care who the hell is pulling me out. And it was then that I thought that the results of the report were going to be favorable. You did a fantastic job. And so my question to you is, based on your experience of doing this, what were your views then on the implementation period and how it should be conducted? Just briefly, having gone through all of this, what were your views once we went into the implementation period?
Well, actually, I remember that visit to Fort Hood, Doug, that you came with us on. That was unusual. Most of the face-to-face encounters that Carter and I had, there was a lot of opposition. Those who gave voice to the view were mostly opposed. But the survey reflected a much different picture, that 70% number I talked about. So implementation, in the military, implementation is everything. And so we used to hear in our large group sessions from the senior enlisted personnel, look, I don't care what happens, just give me the tools to implement the repeal of this. Give me the educational tools and so forth. Implementation was critical to the repeal of this law. And so we spent a lot of time training the force, giving those senior enlisteds the proper tools. You'll remember that the Commandant of the Marine Corps was very against the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and said so publicly. But he also said, give me the training and the implementation tools, and we will get it done first. And he was right. The Marine Corps got it done first. It's a highly disciplined force, amenable to command influence. So when the commandant says do it, they do it. And so that's one of the reasons why it took months to prepare for this after Congress actually voted to repeal it and the president signed it into law.
Well, I will tell you, Jay, I remember that. I remember that about the Marine Commandant. And I also remember that the officer who was in charge of the implementation was a Marine as well, Steve Hummer, who did an unbelievable job. And working side by side with him is our next speaker. Her formal name is Virginia Penrod. All of us know her as V. And in my office and among LGBT troops around the world, she's also known as a saint. She is the person who made the trains run on time. She was in charge of the implementation. V, we're absolutely delighted to have you here. It is so wonderful to see you again after all this time. And I wonder if you could speak for just a bit and tell our listeners what it was like for the implementation, what was involved, what the key elements were, and how you had to go about doing it. And after you, we're going to hear about how it was done in one service in the Air Force.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Doug. And it is a delight to be here. And it's also a delight to see you again. And Jay, I haven't seen you for many years. So what's interesting is I was the DASD for, I think, maybe 3 weeks when a general officer walked into my office and handed me a memo that said, you are now the chairperson of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell for the implementation. And like we always do, you take your orders and you say, okay, we're going to get this done. It's the law. And how are we going to go about doing this? Well, one of the challenges for us was always time. And we had asked for 90 days to develop the training materials because we knew that the training program, that to make it consistent, where all the service members would receive the same type of training, was key to the success of implementation. And so we were told we had a month to develop the training materials, and that became 2 weeks. So we had 2 weeks to develop the plan and materials that were going to be the success or not of implementation. And you would think that would be impossible, but it wasn't, because it was a team effort. From the very beginning, I did not receive any resistance to implementation of this law. And that is very unusual. I have over 50 years in the Department of Defense as of last year. And I will tell you, this was probably one of the most successful projects that I've ever been part of. And I owe that to Secretary of Defense Gates, who from the very beginning said this is a priority with this department. He met with his service chiefs and service secretaries. And if you did not show up to that meeting, he let you know that that will not happen a second time. And then he met on a regular basis to ensure the implementation was going well. When you have that kind of power behind a project, you know that it's going to be successful. So, but I would say a challenge was always time. And everyone was in a hurry to get this done quickly, but we had to ensure it was done right. And we understood that too. Folks were very anxious. They wanted to have it done right, but also quickly, as I stated. And from the Congress to the White House to interested organizations, but more importantly, our service members. And what I did is I used teams within the department that I knew. I had the director of the Department of Defense Education Activity used to work for me, and I reached out and I ask them for help because they draft instructions for students all the time, and they had professionals that knew how to do and develop lesson plans. So not only did they provide their experts, they provided space, computers, everything we needed, and they did that in one day. And so the team showed up at the DODEA headquarters, and in 2 weeks, they developed the training materials. But I will add that the Navy, thank goodness, they had already stepped out and were already working with a contractor on how would you develop training materials. Well, those materials were absolutely the key. We were able to, from March to July, do all the training. You talk over 2 million personnel were trained. And we also implemented, or I should say updated, over 90 personnel policies in that time frame. It usually takes 18 months to update a personnel policy. And our teams went out and we were able to update 90 of those. So I think the fact it was a team effort really made the difference. And speaking of General Hummer, he was our military face of implementation. And he walked around every week to every senior leader in this department, and he briefed them on implementation. It was open kimono. We were so transparent in what we were doing with anyone who asked. We worked with interested organizations to help us, what we call red team, our training to ensure that we were sensitive in our verbiage and that we followed the law. So Jay's team was part of that. But the other concern is what Jay had mentioned, and I think you too, Doug, was the perception by organizations and some in Congress and some senior leaders in the department that repeal would impact military readiness, effectiveness, unit cohesion, recruiting and retention. And I believe by being transparent with how we trained the department, our military members, speaking to our senior leaders, I had to brief both HASC and staff members before we went public on certification. And we spent an hour with these members of the staff of Congress. And when we walked out of that room, we felt very confident that they believed that we had done it right and we had done it professionally.
Well, let me ask you something, V.
Yes.
Looking back on it, 10 years ago today, was there anything in particular that stood out to you that you hadn't anticipated? And was there anything that stood out to you that was easier than you thought it was going to be?
I think the reaction to some of the congressional members and maybe senior leaders that it would be, this would impact military readiness and unit cohesion, because at my level, and I can tell you in 2000 and 2001, I was at the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. And I would say 50 to 60% of my classmates were against any kind of repeal because the issue was being discussed. And just in 10 years' time, that had completely changed. My colleagues, when the law was passed, they said, oh, well, it's not a big deal. Folks had changed over time, and so that surprised me. So it was with some of the senior leaders. We had to spend a lot of time with them to demonstrate that we were going to do this right. It was very deliberate, and that the service members would be well trained before we certified. And I think by taking that time, and to your point, Doug, where you said maybe our service members were anxious because we were taking so long to train, I think that was extremely important to show that we were very deliberative in our training and that we were doing the training properly, and that the entire force was trained.
Well, let me take that point as a bridge into our final speaker. Gordon Tanner is a gentleman and a scholar and one of the most distinguished legal advisors to have served at the Pentagon. He served as the General Counsel of the Army and the General Counsel of the Air Force, and he is a great friend. And he was intimately involved in all aspects of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal, including the implementation. So, Gordon, let me just start by welcoming you and asking if you might build on what V had said about how the various services responded to and stepped up to the plate or not with regards to implementation. How was it with the Air Force?
Well, with the Air Force, thank you. First of all, thank you, Doug, and the team. This is a terrific presentation, and I'm honored to be a part of it. I saw this whole thing unfold from a unique perspective, in that I think I was the only military veteran, openly gay military veteran, who was married to a same-sex husband, serving as a political appointee at the time. So I really had an unusual perspective at this, with feet both in the official side as well as the unofficial side. It's also been said today, too, that no one really knew what to expect. The extraordinary efforts of Jeh Johnson and General Ham, all the work that V. Penrod did in developing the training materials. But when that day came, no one really knew what would happen. Although many of us had gathered at a local bar the night before, where the clock ticked down the seconds to midnight until the repeal was effective, we were unclear what was going to happen. Would there be high heel drag races in the Pentagon Center Court? No one knew. As the first days unfolded, I monitored the reaction through a Pentagon coffee group. It's a group of largely LGBT service members and civilians working in the Pentagon and surrounding area that had secretly met twice weekly for coffee in the Pentagon for many years. I monitored the implementation through this network and was able to assist as the responses were required. Frankly, after repeal, members of this coffee group later became the initial core of what is now the DoD Pride Committee that sponsors and develops the annual Pride celebration. Even this group, though, had no idea what would happen. So what did happen the first few days? I think this has been described as the dog that didn't bark. In some instances, a service member might place a photo of their partner or same-sex spouse on a shelf in their cube, or they might have had a chat with their supervisor. But there were no high heel races in the center court of the Pentagon. Part of the reason, and this has been referred to before, that repeal was not immediate. There was a time when we had to sort through what implementation really meant. And I have to say that the services were terrific in working together. They were largely in lockstep, and so that one could not be played against the other for benefits. Remember that DOMA was...
I want to ask you a question on the point you made there, Gordon. Was there anything that was easier or harder than you had expected when it came to the 6-month implementation period?
Yes. Something that was easier was caused by the Marine Corps. The example was that, as someone has said earlier, they were opposed deeply to the repeal and implementation. But the Commandant of the Marine Corps was in a meeting with a number of the service heads, and frankly, and the issue was same-sex partners or spouses living in family housing on military installations. And there was a lot of concern about this being among the regular influence, all that stuff. And it was the Commandant of the Marine Corps who said, I will not have any second-class Marines. Any benefit that is available to one Marine is going to be available to others. And with that, with that strong statement from the Marine Corps, the rest of the services fell in line, for example, on the housing issue. And that became the mantra for implementing as we addressed benefits for later for ID cards and death benefits and repatriation ceremonies and other entitlements. So that was far easier because of the leadership of the Marine Corps.
Well, building on what you've just said, and we're now going to open this up for a couple of questions among the entire panel here, and I'm going to start with you, Gordon. In retrospect, do you think that we could or should have done anything different regarding implementation than we did? I'm going to start with you, Gordon, and then go to the rest of our panel.
First of all, I think that the reporting and the groundwork of the Johnson-Ham comprehensive report was extraordinary. Now, I just think that not only did that serve to inform Congress and the leadership about its about the climate, but it also served to educate those not only in the Pentagon but across the services about that. So I thought that made it easier. There were some things that could have been done differently. For example, I think that they could have added sexual orientation to the list of non-discrimination protections under the military's Equal Opportunity Program sooner. That didn't happen until 4 years later. That could have happened earlier. But on balance, I think the key to making this the dog that didn't bark was the comprehensive report development and the training materials that Ms. Penrod has mentioned.
Extremely well put, and I'll turn to you, Ms. Penrod, and ask you, is there anything that you think we should have done differently or could have?
Jay, I have to say, you can always look back and think, could we have done things better? But I just don't think so. I think taking our time and engaging at all levels, being transparent was, I think, the importance of making this repeal successful, the implementation successful. I would say just follow on. It did take longer than we had anticipated to work through the benefits issue. But other than that, I think it worked well.
What about you, Jay?
So in my public service, I rarely ask myself, what would I have done differently? Hindsight is brilliant. But hindsight, I'd be a billionaire because I'd buy and sell in the market at exactly the right time. The reason I don't do that is because I generally have a very clear recollection of what we were all grappling with at the time. And at the time, this was an extraordinarily sensitive issue. And I think that the 10-month study, while many were not happy with taking 10 months to study this issue, was about right. And many considered it to be the classic example of how you bring about change in government policy. I like to, when I give lectures about this topic, from a political science point of view, it really was all three branches of government trying to race toward the same result. The courts were beginning to declare don't ask, don't tell unconstitutional. The executive branch, the Obama administration, wanted this done. The president was under a lot of pressure to just by executive action suspend separations, and the Congress was in a race to get this done while they still had the votes in the House to do it. And we got it done in the lame duck session in December 2010. So I look back on it as difficult as it was. I think we did it about the right way. We got it done on a difficult issue, just about the right way.
What about you, Pat? Anything you would have done differently?
Well, I'm focused always on the next target at hand. You always can't hit a moving target. That's what we say in the 82nd Airborne Division. So, to me, it's I got that we couldn't include transgender service members passed in the House and the Senate. So, we could let the perfect be enemy of the good. But I will tell you, I think we all on this call and we have to redouble our efforts because there is 114,000 troops that since World War II have been kicked out because of who they loved. And I know today's announcement from the Biden White House is a great step. Dennis Mcdonough, they could, as long as it's not dishonorable discharge, they could go back and give our gay brothers and sisters, the benefits they've earned. But there's a lot more work that needs to be done to make sure that if we do get someone else in the White House in the future, they can't roll back the progress that we made. It was disheartening, for me that when I did have an opportunity to serve in the Pentagon as the acting secretary and the undersecretary, that we allowed transgender Americans to serve openly. We opened up all the military, all the jobs, opened up to women, including Ranger School and Special Forces. But the fact that in the Trump administration that was rolled back, yes, President Biden has now made it better and even the playing field, but we need to codify it and we need Congress to step up to make sure that future presidents can't roll back the progress that we made. And also focus on the 114,000 that are not getting the benefits that they earned.
You teed this up perfectly, because the final question I want to ask is, and I'm going to ask Aubrey Sarvis and Gordon Tanner to be the ones to comment as members of the LGBT community. I'm going to turn to you first, Aubrey, and ask you if you want to comment here on whether you think we should have done anything different in the implementation, but would also like you to say what remains to be done in your view and in the view of the troops that you have represented for so long. What remains to be done?
Well, Doug, let me pick up on Patrick's remarks. I think that there is much more to be done, and particularly with respect to transgender service. So yes, today we are celebrating that transgender service members can serve openly, but just recently, as Patrick pointed out, their service was challenged by a sitting precedent. So I think that we have to be mindful and frankly remind members of Congress and all of our friends and families who support open service that this should not be taken for granted. And that when we have the opportunity to do so, we should voice our support for open service. To go back to what Jeh said, I think it's difficult to argue with success, but Jeh, all things considered, I would have preferred that we not go down to the final hour. But in the Senate, that's not unusual. And so with those three cloture votes and then parliamentary maneuvers by the then Senate leader, Harry Reid, and with Patrick and Speaker Pelosi and Steny Hoyer sending back a bill that could be called up immediately in the Senate, we got there. But it was a long and a bumpy ride. And again, let's not argue with success, but we came awfully close.
What about you, Gordon? You get the last word here in terms of what remains to be done.
Well, I want to echo what Aubrey said. I think gender identity and sexual orientation are deeply misunderstood in military services, perhaps across the general population of the United States. In particular, in the military community, it can be insular in that many people live on military installations. They have limited engagement with the civilian community, and many spend their whole lives living on or near military installations. And I think that more work needs to be done to educate and expose our members to the issues associated with both gender identity and sexual orientation. And those are very different things.
We're going to have a chance for our audience to ask questions in just a few minutes. And I just want to remind our audience that you can ask questions in the chat box at cnas.org/live, and don't hesitate to do that. And also in just a second, we're going to hear from a very special guest on this program. But I want to go back as we conclude to this little pocket calendar 10 years ago today. The final thing on my calendar was something called post-presser. That's Pentagon speak for saying there's going to be something after the press conference. I was told that we couldn't really have a big celebration after this milestone because, as I was told by one person, we don't want to look like we're spiking the ball. I thought that was a bit short-sighted because the path that we had all taken for so long, and so many of us had, we needed to have an acknowledgement of what this actually meant. So at the press conference, I invited 10 LGBT service members from all the various services, many of them who were part of that coffee that you talked about, Gordon, Alex Wagner, and Rudy Raines and others, to be in the back of the press room, just so that they could be part of and see Secretary Panetta and Admiral Mullen give the final green light. I had also taken the liberty of bringing from my home in Rehoboth Beach, where you now live as well, Gordon, 2 cases of Dogfish Head ale, which is the specialty of Rehoboth Beach. And I thought I would bring as many people as I could into my office just to open a bottle of Dogfish Head ale and celebrate, led by the 10 who were in the room. So after the press conference, they all rolled in. And then some of my staff started to come in. And then V, you came in, and Steve came in, and some of the people who were part of the implementation team. And people from Jeh Johnson's office came in, and Jay came in. And then there were people from the secretary's level who came in, and members of the press. And all of a sudden, and Aubrey, so many people who had been watching this from the advocacy community, from Third Way and Service Members Legal Defense Fund and Service Members United and CAP. And then in a room that holds maybe 40 and with 70 people in it, in came a young man in uniform and a young woman in uniform with a book. And he came up to me and he said, "Sir, you know me as Jay Smith, the anonymous name I have used on the phone with you for months because I couldn't be out. But my name is Josh Seafried, and I'm the head of OutServe, and this is Katie Miller, who had to leave West Point because she was not able to be a whole human being. And we want to give you this book that's called Our Time, which is the stories of so many of our colleagues, what it was like to serve hidden." And I said, "I can only give you a Dogfish Head beer to celebrate this moment." And we all opened it at the same time. And we didn't spike the ball, but we opened together bottles of beer to celebrate our common humanity and the fact that so many people who had served their country for so long with double lives could now serve as one, as whole human beings. It's to all of those on this panel and all of those who are listening and so many friends around the country that we can say that ultimately this repeal marked what I think Patrick said earlier, that this was a nothing burger and that the country was ready and that the services which reflect the country have led to so many outstanding men and women in uniform to be able to marry who they please, have families, and to serve their country as whole human beings as they should. And with that, it's my great pleasure to be able to present a very short video by one of the 3 senators who in December of 2010, after the second defeat of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell legislation in the combined defense bill, talked with Senators Lieberman and Senator Reed about doing this as a standalone. So I'm pleased to greet on video the Honorable Senator Susan Collins of Maine.
On September 20th, 2011, the discriminatory Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy that prevented patriotic men and women from serving our armed services based on their sexual orientation came to an end. This 10th anniversary is a time to celebrate a victory for individual liberty and equality. I was proud to join Senator Joe Lieberman in leading the repeal effort in the United States Senate. I remain grateful to the many people who provided support and encouragement during that challenging task. The path to repeal was long and difficult, with obstacles on both sides of the aisle. In May of 2010, the Armed Services Committee debated the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell behind closed doors. At that time, I was the only Republican senator to vote for repeal. In early December of that year, the massive defense policy bill including repeal, had passed the House. But then, unexpectedly, the Democratic Senate Majority Leader walked away from negotiations. It was clear that we needed another route to repeal. Senator Lieberman and I decided right then and there on the Senate floor to introduce and push for a standalone measure. Over the next 10 days, we built a strong bipartisan coalition. And on December 20th, our legislation passed by a vote of 65 to 31. And 2 days later, it was signed into law. Several months later, I received a postcard from a service member who at the time did not identify himself or herself. It was only later that I learned that it was a female soldier. She wrote that she would still be in Afghanistan on September 20th when Don't Ask, Don't Tell officially ended. She thanked me for helping to lift this burden off her shoulders, since the combat zone is stressful enough on its own. That postcard was signed simply, an Army soldier. The fact that she had to shield her identity demonstrated what repeal meant for countless members of our armed forces. September 20th, 2011, the day repeal took effect, is one that I will never forget. I saw men and women in uniform celebrating this great step forward. Those patriots are the real heroes we honor on this landmark anniversary.
And we thank Senators Collins, Senator Lieberman, Senator Reed, and all of those who like Pat Murphy as the pioneer, pushed so hard in our Congress to get this repeal finally enacted. We're now open for questions from the audience, and I have the first one that I'm going to direct to you, V, and others on the panel should feel free to comment as well. The questioner asks, what are the current protections for LGBT personnel, and who is responsible for enforcing those protections?
Okay, thank you, Doug. Well, the current protections are in policy. Our policy was changed early in this administration to allow LGBTQ members to serve openly. Also, when you say who's responsible, every commander, every supervisor, everyone in DoD is responsible to protect all service members from harm. And I want to quote Secretary Austin on this. And he did this at the department's Pride event this past June. He said, our work isn't done until we create a safe and supportive workplace for everyone, free from discrimination, harassment, and fear. Nobody should have to hide who they love to serve the country that they love. No service member who is willing to put their life on the line to keep our country safe should feel unsafe because of who they are. So when you hear that from the top, it goes all the way down into the department. And so that's why it's just very important. And once a program is in place, the longer it is in place, the harder it is to undo. I think everyone who's had experience will agree to that. But the protection, the best protection is always the courts and the law to ensure that service members cannot be mistreated or judged unfairly because of who they are. Thank you.
Anybody else on the panel want to comment on this? Gordon or Jay or Jay, you have anything to add?
I agree with everything V said, and I want to repeat what I said in the private chat. It's career personnel like V. Penrod that are the backbone of our U.S. government, and I feel better knowing that V is still at the Pentagon.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Gordon, anything from your vantage point that you would add to what V had to say? You'd have to do that with your unmuted, though. There you go.
Talented senior leaders like V. Penrod are the best insurance for continued enforcement of this policy. She is vigilant, and she's exactly right. We have to be mindful that our commanders are the front lines. It's one thing to have knowledge and information inside the Pentagon. It's a challenge beyond the building to get the word out, not only to our active duty, but to Guard and Reserve as well. So, but I have every confidence that V and her team are doing exactly that.
Thank you.
Kate, what's next? Here we are. The second question is what are the current protections for LGB personnel? Who is responsible for addressing those? V, I'm going to turn to you for that as well.
I think that was the first one. I think the next one is the those that were discharged. So what? Yes. So what was put in place? An individual who was discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell has the opportunity to petition the Board of Correction of Military Records. You have 15 years to petition the board. There are 5 years left on that. However, the board will also, if an individual feels they have compelling evidence and passes that time frame, they can still petition the board, and the board will take that under consideration. So that is, and one thing I will point out too that has changed, we've made it easier, for example, to change your gender identity for your records on the DD Form 214 for a discharged member, retired service member, which is very important for that member. And we've made that so much easier than it was before.
But let me just ask, by the way, Aubrey's comment on this, because I know that the whole issue of discharge upgrades has been something central to you and your constituency.
I think over the 18 months of COVA that we've been going through, there's been a delay and a backlog, and that process hasn't been working well. So I think we have to find ways to accelerate that. I'm not sure, but I believe today there will be an announcement from the VA that the secretary there is issuing a directive which may be helpful along this line. But I'll wait on that until we have the full details from the secretary's office and the authority that is being used which would permit veterans discharged under Don't Ask, Don't Tell to apply for and receive benefits from the VA. But again, I think this will be an announcement coming from the Biden administration shortly. But again, I think we all have to be proactive and addressing this and finding a way to help those who've been wronged by Don't Ask, Don't Tell and wronged by the previous separations that were made solely on the basis of sexual orientation.
Hey, Doug, can I add something?
You can indeed.
History has a way of repeating itself. This is back in a time when we did have second-class citizens in the U.S. military. This is my uncle, Robert Johnson, who was a Tuskegee Airman and a bombardier navigator in World War II. He participated in what is known as the Freeman Field Mutiny in Indiana in April 1945. He refused to leave a white-only officers' club, he and 100 other Tuskegee Airmen, for which he was dishonorably discharged from the U.S. Army. And it was only in 2001 that the Board for the Correction of Military Records finally corrected the record so that he no longer had a dishonorable discharge. But interesting footnote, there was a real split in my family about whether to have his record changed, because many felt that it would be erasing history, whitewashing history, to upgrade his discharge, but it got done.
Let me ask you, Jay, because the next question is for you. Was there any point during the comprehensive review when you yourself thought that it might not pass?
Yes. multiple. General Ham and I would go out to military bases and hear from 200 service members at a time what they thought about this law. And everybody had an opinion. And most of the people who were willing to stand up in front of their colleagues and say something were against repeal. We'd hear over and over again, well, the law is working, why change it? And I wanted to say to them, well, the law is working for you, but it's not working for your gay and lesbian service members who can't speak up in this open session like you can. And so there was a lot of opposition on multiple fronts, moral and religious, based on the stereotype. Interestingly, the biggest split was not service to service. It was not generational. It was gender. The women were like, guys, get over this. You know, you make way too big a deal of this. Get over it. And there was a turning point in the discussions, for me at least, in what I was hearing. One day, and I can't remember what base it was, for the 100th time, somebody stood up and said, I've been in Afghanistan, I've been a combat veteran, I've killed Taliban. I got a problem taking a shower with a homosexual. And I finally decided to challenge somebody in one of these open forums. And I said, okay, you've told me you've been in combat, you've killed the Taliban, you've been in Afghanistan, but you can't take a shower with a gay man. What are you afraid of? Tell me exactly what you are afraid of. And the whole room looked at him like, hey, I really want to see you answer that question. And so what it came down to was when the military, and I think this happened during the 10-month study, when we were stirring the pot, began a conversation where people began to ask themselves, what are we really worried about? And so by the time the study was issued, I believe that that sentiment within the military had changed significantly. But there were multiple times when I thought, hey, it's wartime, we're fighting two wars. The view seems to be not now, please. But the survey results really were an eye-opener.
Well, I have to tell you, Jay, I remember that question being asked as well. The whole shower question, that seemed to be a real thing for people at Fort Hood. And I remember somebody in the audience shouting out when that question was asked, you already have, meaning you already have taken a shower, you already have bunked with men and women who are LGBT, and it's meant nothing and you haven't known because they couldn't be open. I also remember, in terms of the passage of the repeal, that in November, and I'm with Aubrey in terms of the timing. In November, when the report came out, I personally thought there was a kind of a pause on behalf of top leadership in terms of what it was going to take, the push it was going to take to get this through a Senate that had just seen an election where party control was going to be changed, and there were other things competing, kind of like scorpions in a bottle for attention, like the SALT treaty and the budget. And I remember that the court back and forth that you talked about was really the motivating factor, I think, for leadership in the department to say, we're going to have to really push this now with the members of the Senate. Otherwise, this is going to be something that will be decided in a kind of a back and forth with the courts. I also remember, Jay, as you'll remember as well, a phone call we had with Sam Nunn, who had been the author of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell legislation 17 years earlier. I had come to know Nunn through my work with the former Bill Cohen, and found him to be an actually very thoughtful individual who, for a number of reasons, understood the change in the country. And I remember being peppered by questions as we got close to the repeal date in December about, whether we were going to win the vote or not. So I reached out to Senator Nunn and asked whether there would be any possibility whether I could get Jeh Johnson to give him a summary, an executive summary of this report, and see whether he would be supportive. And he said, I'd like to get other former members of from the Senate on this as well, including former Senator Bayh and former Senator David Boren of Oklahoma, which he did. And at the end of your call with him, I stayed on and he said, all right, what is it you want me to do? I said, I would appreciate if I could direct the Associated Press reporter to you and you tell him what you think of the repeal vote. And he took the call and he told the reporter, I support the repeal. And I think that that was a very important move forward at a very critical time. Does anybody else have any comments you want to make about, as we got toward repeal, whether you thought it wouldn't pass? Yes, Pat?
Well, the only thing I would say is I was part of the collateral damage. I lost my election that November, and it's okay because then I eventually got a chance to go help lead the Army. So it worked out. But I will say, a lot of folks said, "Hey, what was it worth it? You lost your seat." I was only the third Democrat in history and the first Democrat in over 30 years to represent, the Pennsylvania First District. But I used to tell people, I say, listen, Judgment Day is more important than Election Day. And even though we came up a little short, and I lost my race in 64 of us lost our race, and obviously the balance of power changed in the House and the Senate. But I think the most important part is we didn't take our eye off the ball. The very next day, I'm on the phone with Aubrey Sarvis. I'm working hand in glove, with Jeh Johnson and you, Doug, and so many others to make sure, we ran through the tape. And the tape didn't end on Election Day. The tape, for me, ran out on January 3rd of 2011. And that's when the next day I became a civilian on January 4th of 11. So I think when we all have that opportunity to serve, whether you're V in the Pentagon or Gordon Tanner or wherever we all are, it's important that we recognize that there's a lot more work that we have to do. And yes, there was those moments when it looked dark and it looked like it couldn't happen. I mean, my local paper editorialized against the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell in Bucks County. It's a moderate suburban district of Philadelphia. But, at the end of the day, when you have the courage of your convictions, you have to be willing to fight for it. And obviously, I think history will judge. It was absolutely positively the right thing to do. But as was mentioned earlier, we have to redouble our efforts and there's more work to be done.
Pat, you provide a really good coda to this panel. There is more work to be done, particularly with regard to the trans community. We saw reverses between 2016 and 2020. Those reverses are being reversed themselves, but there is a lot more work to be done. Before I turn it back to Kate and to CNAS, I first want to thank all of you who participated on this panel. You are all my friends. This is such a wonderful reunion, and I can't thank you enough. And what I'd like to do for you and for all of those who are listening is reach over and grab the last bottle of Dogfish Head from that day 10 years ago, which I took home as my souvenir. And if you have a glass or cup of anything in front of you at your computers anywhere around the country as you're watching this, I hope you'll raise a glass with me to say, happy anniversary. Thank you so much for all the work that you did. We have a lot more work to go, but it shows that change can happen and that in the military, reflective of our society, it can often be the leaders in terms of how we do that. And Kate, thanks to you and CNAS, and back to you.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you to the wonderful panelists for participating in today's discussion. And thank you especially to the CNAS comms team who made this all happen. To learn more about future events and discussions like this one, please go to cnas.org or follow us on Twitter. And again, thank you for joining us today. Please keep that conversation going.